of national strategies stemming from the Environment Act. So the overall purpose of these is to tackle the element of the environment and the Environment Act around halting the decline of biodiversity and halting habitat loss. So they are a statutory piece of work which require 48 local authorities to act as what are termed responsible authorities for the development of local nature recovery strategies. So the principles behind these is that they will cover the entire landmass of England from Land's End to the borders. They will complement one another. So neighbours are working collaboratively to make sure that the contents within neighbouring authorities, LNRSs, are compatible. And one of the underlying principles is no overlap, no duplication, no gaps. It is important to point out that their remit stretches to mean low water. So when we're talking about coastal counties such as our own, from a legal perspective, we do not have to include anything beyond mean low water. We made the decision fairly early doors in the development process that as a coastal county, it would be remiss not to include the marine environment. As such, our local nature recovery strategy will include the marine environment. We've done a lot of work on nature recovery in relation to our seas out to 12 nautical miles, because that mirrors the coverage of the Yorkshire Marine Nature Partnership, who are an important partner in the development of this process. But from a legal perspective, it doesn't have to be included. And that's both sort of got its pros and cons associated with it. The major con is that it means that there are not currently any nationally funded delivery mechanisms for nature recovery in the marine environment. The pro means that we do, to an extent, have a bit of a blank canvas as to how we include marine within the local nature recovery strategy. The statutory elements of the strategy are fairly tightly bound with both statutory guidance and non-statutory guidance dictating what the strategy should and shouldn't be. So the most important two questions, I suppose, that we often get at this stage is well, what does an LNRS look like? I think when we say nature recovery strategy, anyone who is engaged or interested in nature to any degree will immediately have their own idea as to what something called a nature recovery strategy should be. And then what are the actual mechanisms going to be for implementation? So through the Environment Act, there are sort of three key elements, statutory elements that relate to this. The local nature recovery strategy is the overarching arm in regards to nature recovery. We then have biodiversity net gain, which is one of the primary funding mechanisms for the local nature recovery. And then within public bodies, not just local authorities, but any public body sort of above parish council level, we now have a new statutory biodiversity duty. So we're legally obligated to demonstrate how we're conserving and enhancing nature. And the local nature recovery strategy is the primary means of doing so. So the local nature recovery strategy as a public body will allow us to demonstrate delivery of our biodiversity duty, at least in part, and biodiversity net gain in part will be the key funding mechanism for this. So for anyone unfamiliar with biodiversity net gain, it came into full force in February for large developments and April for small developments. But this is basically the principle that developers now should leave biodiversity enhanced from the baseline, the development site, pre-development to post. And that's calculated using a metric which essentially converts biodiversity value into units, and as a minimum, 10% gain has to be demonstrated primarily on site, but if that's not possible, developers can pay money to deliver the net gain off site. And LNRS will identify where that money is best spent for nature recovery off site. So ideally, it will channel the money into the areas where we'll get the biggest bang for our buck, ecologically speaking. And it does that by giving you an uplift. So essentially, biodiversity units within the nature recovery strategy, nature recovery network area will be worth 15% more than if they were delivered outside. This is all very new policy. The sector is still getting up to speed with it, but it is potentially a bit of a game changer from a national nature policy perspective. So in terms of what they are, I suppose there's what they have to be, and then there's what within our local nature recovery strategy for Hull and East Yorkshire we want it to be. So from a legal perspective, there are some things that they have to contain, but at their heart, they are tools to help people who want to deliver nature recovery target where it's best placed to take place, and their channel funding towards it. So the strategy at its core will contain a statement of biodiversity priorities. These are within the local context, so they will be relevant to Hull and East Yorkshire. We will map what are termed the existing areas of importance for biodiversity, and we've finished that process now, so I can give you an update on that in the next slide. And then the element that we are right in the weeds with it as we speak are looking at the measures and priorities for improving and creating habitat and associated environmental goals. So the strategy is nature first, but we do pay consideration to things like air quality, carbon storage, carbon sequestration, flood alleviation, and all those wider nature-based solutions and environmental co-benefits that come with nature recovery. And then we'll have our set of priorities for nature recovery. The strategy itself is principally habitats focused, but species are incorporated into it. And ultimately, the priority setting process is based around the Lawtonian principles of creating a landscape of habitats, wild habitats that are bigger, better, and more joined up. So the area of existing, so that's the sort of update, I guess, in terms of what this is for anyone who is just getting up to speed with local nature recovery strategies. The first update in the development of ours is we have completed the mapping of areas of existing importance for nature. Now, these are predefined within the statutory guidance. So the guidance from DEFRA tells us what those are. So there's no real room for discretion here or any sort of subjective views on it. So any land which is designated for nature or ecological conservation reasons is considered to be an area of existing importance for nature. Quality of habitat at the moment doesn't really come into it. So we could have areas of land which are incredibly high ecological value, but aren't designated. They won't be captured as an area of existing importance. They would be considered an opportunity. And again, that's a national process, the definition. It's not a local definition. So in East Yorkshire, we have, or in East Riding of Yorkshire, we have a local wildlife site system. So we have a number of designated and candidate local wildlife sites. As this strategy also covers the City of Hull, within Hull City Council, they don't have designated local wildlife sites at the moment, only candidates. Candidates don't qualify as existing areas of importance. That's not to say they're not important, and that's not to say they won't form part of the opportunity. It's just in terms of this first step map, it is only designated sites. It's only designated sites and areas of irreplaceable habitat as defined through the biodiversity net gain legislation. So examples of irreplaceable habitat would be things like salt marsh and ancient woodlands. So this is the map for the Hull and East Yorkshire local nature recovery strategy areas of importance of areas currently important for biodiversity. So everything in green, essentially. The red line boundary is our statutory boundary for local nature recovery. So you can see on the coast, it just runs down the coast. It doesn't include the marine environment. The blue lines are how we've broken up the landscape. So you can see out towards the right of the image, out into the North Sea, that blue line is the 12 nautical mile limit that we have set ourselves, or that our technical team and partners have decided is appropriate. So as you can see, the designated sites within the region are fairly widely scattered. There are clearly going to be challenges around connectivity of those sites which are not on river systems. So, you can see the designations along the River Hull, and the designations down the border with North Yorkshire along the Derwent Valley are fairly well connected because of the river systems, and likewise the Humber. The inland sites are much more scattered. So from the element of connecting these up through the notional nature recovery network, that's going to be a priority. The circle here zooms in on Hull. So you can see within Hull boundaries, there are actually only two sites which meet the definition for areas currently important for biodiversity, which are the 2 local nature reserves in Hull. But again, just to emphasise, this isn't a subjective local decision. It's with it set by the definitions nationally. So that presents some real opportunity within Hull, because there's a lot of sites within Hull which do have potential value for biodiversity. So going forward and within LNRS delivery, it could be that LNRS could be the catalyst for getting some more sites designated and therefore having them considered within the planning process and potentially even within further protections. And then you can also see, as I'm sure you're all aware, we've got the Humber estuary. So we have the interesting scenario with the Humber estuary where a reasonable chunk of the channel doesn't sit within either ours nor Lincolnshire's local nature recovery strategy. So we're working very closely with Lincolnshire to make sure that we don't let the channel, I suppose, slip through either of our nets. And we're looking at how we work collaboratively to have the channel considered within both of our local nature recovery strategies. But from a neighbour perspective, we only share a very small terrestrial border with both South Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. The rest of us we're largely swallowed up by North Yorkshire, so we're working very, very closely with North Yorkshire, particularly across those the Wolds landscape and down the Derwent, to make sure that our approaches complement one another. So just for clarity, the 2 local nature reserves within Hull are Noddle Hill and Rockford Fields. So timelines for this, which is probably quite another significant update. We are still aiming for 2025 as the final LNRS publication. Our original plan was to start the approval process in late spring, early summer of this year. We have extended that into later 2024 on the basis of there's some significant guidance documents from DEFRA, which we're expecting that still haven't been published. So over the course of the spring, we've had a couple of key guidance documents come out towards the end of February and early March. And there's still at least one significant guidance document which hasn't been published yet, which could potentially shape what we have to do or what we are recommended to do within the LNRS. So we've made the decision to extend the development period by a few months to ensure that we can accommodate those when they land. Which leads us on to the bulk of tonight's content. So we've mentioned in the previous webinars had quite a strong focus on engagement, and engagement is where we'd focus the bulk of our time from our notification of being a responsible authority in the summer of 2023 all the way through until February 2024. And one of the reasons for that is because as much as the local nature recovery strategy has to be evidence-based, looking at ecological evidence, and part of the evidence base in our decision making is also what people think. So our project team is made up of a myriad of organisations which represent both organisations whose focus is nature conservation, but also we've got a lot of land management organisations. We also have a lot of organisations who focus on other elements of the environment. And then outside of that, we've got what our residents think, what our businesses think, and what smaller organisations who aren't part of the formal project team think. So between October and February, we worked with our partners, RSK Wilding, to run a series of engagement events, which I'm sure some of you participated in. So we had some specific workshops with land managers, farmers, landowners, and also town, ward and parish councillors. As well as surveys for land managers, the general public, and that's individual residents, anyone they could have responded from outside of the region, but also there was the ability to respond on behalf of specific businesses and interest groups. We identified, and we covered it in the last webinar, that when it came to the sort of priorities within the wider public, the marine and coastal environment didn't come out particularly highly. We wanted to understand what people thought in relation to those specific habitats. So we also ran a coastal and marine survey through the Yorkshire Marine Nature Partnership for both ourselves and North Yorkshire. So it covered the length of the Yorkshire coast up to the North Yorkshire boundary. And we touched on that in the previous webinar as well, but we've got a wee bit more detail to come up tonight in later slides. And in terms of how we've approached engagement, it's been a combination of everything that we've really had the capacity to do. So we're on a series of in-person workshops. Some of those have been online, but the majority of them have been in person with specific stakeholder groups. We've run the surveys online as well as paper versions throughout our libraries within East Yorkshire for to make sure that they're accessible to those who weren't online. We continue to run these webinars and we'll continue to do so throughout the entire process. And we've also had press social media output, so BBC News, Yorkshire Post, etc. have picked us up. And we're continuing with those as and when we've got particular key points in the process that we'd like to draw people's attention to. So in total, across all of the engagement activities, we've had about 625 respondents, which as a proportion of the population is obviously not enormous. It is pretty much bang average for LNRS engagement across the country. So, well, so we're told from Natural England's perspective. So I think it demonstrates very clearly that we need to continue with engagement to raise awareness of LNRS, raise awareness of what it is, because it will be going to statutory consultation. But we did get a fairly good geographic spread across the county. So just a very quick overview on dates. So we've got some of the major activities that we've run. And in addition to the attendees live within the webinars, we've also had over 500 YouTube views between I think there's 3 current LNRS related videos up, and this one will be the 4th, hopefully later in the week. So we've made a real effort to try and spread the physical events across the county, bearing in mind as long as they were appropriate areas for the actual stakeholder groups that we were targeting. So within the agricultural workshops, we spread them. We had some down in Holderness, some in the centre of the county, some down towards Gilside, others up towards the Wolds. And then we've supplemented that with an online workshop for anyone who was either unable to attend or on the date or unable to attend due to it being during the working day. So we've been running the online workshops in the evenings. And this all kicked off, pardon me, with a workshop stroke almost mini conference based at Picton Grange back in October, where we had a suite of technical stakeholders come up with an initial draft vision statement for what we want to get from our local nature recovery strategy. So you can see within the word tree there, the sort of the key terms that were coming out. So off the top of my head, we had organisations like RSPB, Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, Natural England, National Farmers Union, Hull City Council, East Riding Council, and many others that I probably should give reference to, but I can't quite remember off the top of my head, come up with a specific local hook that we want the LNRS to try and deliver. We have the national vision statement, which is just about environmental recovery, but in regards to our region, it was felt very strongly that people in place was equally as important as nature within the whole LNRS process. So obviously we're still working with drafts at this stage, so this may be tweaked, but as it stands, this is the sort of vision statement that we're running with for the Hull and East Yorkshire LNRS. And then we've got the detail of the engagement activities that we ran. So we touched on these in the last webinar in regards to what different audiences, how different audiences felt around biodiversity within the region. So the question around to what extent different stakeholder groups are concerned wasn't one that necessarily informs the prioritisation process or any of the statutory elements of the LNRS. But we felt that this process gave us an opportunity to begin sort of baselining values in regards to nature in the region. And this gives us the option over time of repeating these questions in other surveys associated with the LNRS or potentially other work, and looking at whether or not these sort of values-based questions change at all. So within the sort of agricultural stroke landowner category, and I should say that was a specific survey for a very specific audience, so therefore it did have fewer respondees. Again, you've got the majority are concerned about nature to some extent. And if you combine to some and to large, you're looking at over 3/4 of the people who participated in that. The broader general audience, so much larger sample size here, the majority of them were concerned to a large extent, maybe about 15%. I think it was slightly less. To some extent, the forms over 90% of the respondents. And then within those who responded to the coastal marine survey, again, all of the respondents were concerned to some degree around nature's decline in relation to either the region generally or the coastal marine environment in Hull and East Yorkshire, but as well as North Yorkshire for that specific survey. So we'll keep an eye on these year after year in regards to how the sort of perception of nature's decline potentially changes within our residents, and hopefully we'll be able to build up more momentum with these surveys to help us increase the sample size as well. But the nuts and bolts and the results that will start feeding into our prioritisation process for LNRS is really the important part of these surveys. So the prioritisation process will include a number of criteria to get what is a very, very long list of species and habitats provided centrally from national government. And our technical team have then sort of looked at what's relevant and what's appropriate for the region. But one of the criteria that we'll use in the shortlisting process will be the results of the survey. So what do people think should be prioritised? We won't necessarily be prioritising things solely based upon this. We have to factor in the ecological evidence, the expert view, but this will be a consideration. So across all of the surveys, when ranked, the categories that we provided based upon the outputs of our technical team meetings, it is quite interesting because it's fairly unusual across work like this that invertebrates comes out top, but invertebrates came out top in both the agricultural and public surveys. So some of these taxonomic groups aren't relevant to the coastal marine survey, reptiles, no surprise. But it was really interesting that invertebrates came out rather than some of the more charismatic taxa, which is really, really useful information. And then within the survey, there are also free text questions. So across all of the engagement activities, after all of the conversations within workshops have been analysed, after the free text questions within the surveys have been analysed, the graph below is essentially the outcome for the frequency for these taxonomic groups and species assemblages being mentioned. So although within the survey invertebrates came out top, when we analysed all of the engagement activity, it was very much birds. So it's not. So this is basically any reference to birds as being a priority, whether the farmland, whether it's wading birds, coastal birds, seabirds. The majority of respondents had birds in there, and then everything else is relatively equal in the mid-range. So mammals come next, and then plants. It's always interesting where plants sit, particularly given that it is a habitats first really based strategy. And then the same, essentially the same activity, but looking at habitats, there are more of them. So across the surveys, flood meadows and wetlands with associated grasslands were the highest supported habitat type. Now, it's probably worth considering the timing of this because these surveys were live over Christmas, so they closed, I think it was on the 7th of January, and from a regional perspective, that was the point where we were starting to get very wet. It wasn't the worst of the flooding across the landscape, but I would assume that water management was very close to people's heart at that point in time, whereas the agricultural survey was still open then, but the workshops had already taken place. So we at the time of the agricultural workshops, we didn't know what we were in for in terms of winter weather. But irrespective of that, my gut feeling is that the water-based habitats probably still would have scored quite highly. But again, it's something for us to keep eye on through LNRS delivery is whether sort of immediate conditions at the time of response do sort of affect the perception as to what's important. And then similarly across all of the engagement activities, when the conversations and various other activities were analysed, the graph on the right of my screen, maybe the left of yours, but the graph here highlights the priorities from a habitats perspective. So you can see watercourse generally comes out very, very high, but because of the different terms that people used, we've also got, I guess, subcategories. So you've got water bodies, wetlands, which all overlap, and obviously meadows comes out very, very high there. And it's interesting, I think, given that we are a region which is around 90% agricultural in terms of our land use, where we look at things like you've got generic agricultural land, but we've also got field margins, hedgerow are in there, hedgerow scores very highly. So those sort of hedges and edges type habitats are scoring relatively highly compared to some of the other habitat types. And it's interesting within the local area that disused railway line has come up. I can't imagine that that's something that appears on many LNRSs, but we obviously have quite a well-developed public access a network of disused railways, which aren't only public access, but many of them are also designated local wildlife sites. So some of those longer stretches of green on that map I showed you previously, those will be disused railways, which have got quite a lot of value and potential as dispersal corridors. The other thing's probably worth mentioning in regards to this is the majority of respondents that we got by region were based in Hull. So there'll be certain habitats here that may be more reflective of the urban environment than some of the other ones, just because of the numbers that we got from Hull, which is really positive that we're getting the sort of that degree of response, given that we as East Riding Council are developing it with Hull included. And then we also had free text questions and a mapping question to allow respondents to identify specific locations within the region that they wanted or that they felt was particularly important. And so we had 149 locations that were specifically mentioned. There were some that we had to discount or sort of treat carefully because the locations were named either using colloquialisms that we weren't familiar with, or they were just misnamed. So if it wasn't a site that was very easily attributed to a site's formal name, we had to dismiss it. So for example, I think one of the survey responses referred to Driffield wetlands. We've taken that to mean the sort of floodplains around the River Hull, around Driffield. Rather than because there is no site known as Driffield wetlands. But the top three most commonly named sites were the Humber Estuary, which is again unsurprising given its global importance, the River Hull, which again unsurprising given it's such a feature of the county. It's a chalk river, it's largely triple SI, and then Priory Meadow, which is interesting because it's not a particularly high profile site regionally, but I think probably reflects the importance of it to Hull and Hull's residents, that it's been flagged up there. So again, from my perspective, it's really positive that we're having Hull reflected in the sort of top end of the prioritisation process here. So just to reassure everyone, it's not the case that we're just going to take these three sites forward. We're just highlighting the top three of the 149 that were specifically mentioned. And the geographic spread of the 149 was fairly widespread again across the entire county, ranging from very specific, very small sites to sort of landscapes like the Wolds. So again, these will feed into the decision-making process around opportunity mapping. Now, the Humber Estuary and the River Hull are largely or entirely covered by that stage 1 map, the map of existing importance, because of the designations in place. But Priory Meadow isn't captured by that. So again, it's really, really useful information. And as part of the engagement, we also wanted to understand, particularly from those who are in a position to influence land management at scale, what's stopping them looking at nature recovery. What are going to be things that makes this difficult for them? Whether they are a farmer who farms their own land, whether they are a parish council, or other landowners. We've got some Ministry of Defence land in the region, for example. And the key four that came out were scepticism on the commitment to delivery. So this varied between groups of people that we spoke to, and the scepticism often linked to different elements. But I think scepticism around the funding was a common theme within the land manager workshop. And really the other three barriers on here all kind of feed into that. And then there's scepticism over the approach that is coming from government, in that while we as a local authority are responsible for developing the strategy, delivery will fall on, at the moment anyway, the intention is that delivery will be carried out through partnership working. So there were question marks just around how that's going to work. And I think that's probably fair, because we haven't had a lot of guidance from national government on that. So we are going to relatively soon, I won't say too soon, but over the summer months, possibly into the autumn, probably start a separate work stream, sort of mapping out what delivery models for LNRS can look like, who needs to be involved and to what extent. There was a degree of confusion as well over what LNRS was for. I think that stems from the fact that nationally within press, biodiversity net gain has really been the headline grabber over the last few years. So there was a general lack of awareness as to what nature recovery strategies were. And there was a degree of confusion around the fact that people who were aware of them knew that they were habitats focused, but then species had sort of been added on. So what it meant was we spent quite a bit of time in these conversations sort of going through what the purpose of LNRS was, and the fact that it is, although it's very holistic, in truth, it's quite narrow in its scope. It is solely about nature recovery. It's about identifying the best land for recovery and trying to channel the funds to those areas. There are question marks around how LNRS will be incorporated into other plans, policy and decision making. And those were fair, particularly early stage in the development process. So we're at the point now where we've got a suite of activities coming up over the next few weeks, and a big part of that is essentially mapping existing plans, policies. It's important within the LNRS from a statutory perspective that we complement other strategies, but we don't necessarily have to complement them depending on what they say, but we certainly shouldn't be repeating what is in them. So LNRS should be its own unique thing. And then obviously the question is going to be, how is this going to be paid for? And that question really stemmed from the fact that at the time of these conversations, biodiversity net gain hadn't been passed through government yet, because we were having these conversations around December time, and biodiversity net gain came in February. But also the other principal funding stream at this point in time are agri-environment schemes, which there is a degree of confusion around what the sort of new agri-environment schemes are going to look like post-Brexit, and how ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, is going to fit in. So these were all really jumping ahead, really useful feedback, because it helps us shape maybe less so the development of the strategy itself, but it certainly lets us identify key things we need to pick up very early on in the delivery process for nature recovery strategy, so into 2025. And then we also wanted to know where stakeholders felt the opportunities were and the measures associated with them. So within LNRS parlance, measures are essentially actions to be taken on the ground, and opportunities are sort of higher level. So an opportunity might be to increase the number of woodlands in positive management, and the measure might be to increase the amount of rotational coppicing or glade creation, ride creation, etc. within those woodlands. So the measures are the very practical delivery actions. So the top ones that came out here was sort of general improved habitat management, which might sound obvious, but actually it's quite interesting because it's focused on management of existing habitats rather than creation of new habitats. Community education and engagement, which is obviously important. There's I guess it's natural to automatically think about our towns and urban environments for those who maybe don't live directly, in the rural space, but actually we feel that this is probably quite important across the entire region around nature recovery. wildlife corridors existing between protected sites, which again is interesting that the survey results and the conversations identified the need for corridors between protected areas rather than sort of all areas of habitat. And then limiting or damaging activities related to development. So that's obviously a little bit more contentious. The national vision with LNRS is that it shouldn't prevent development, but in line with BNG, BNG should be the route to theoretically making it potentially cost prohibitive to develop on highly valuable sites, because the level of biodiversity net gain that developers would have to deliver will be far higher on a ecologically important site versus a less important site. Ensuring appropriate funding to protect existing biodiverse spaces. Again, so it's interesting that the focus there is on existing spaces, and then habitat creation. So this tended to come up, as you can see from the example there, more in the marine and coastal one. So seagrass, kelp forest, etc. But obviously habitat creation is relevant terrestrially as well. And then we also wanted to know what this needed to look like for it to be useful to people. It is a strategy. The classic strategy will be a very long PDF document uploaded onto a website. LNRS has to include the mapping element, so there is always going to be a mapping component to this, but those maps can have all sorts of bells and whistles on. So the feedback that we had from pretty much all stakeholder groups that we've engaged with so far is that it needs to be simple and accessible for non-technical audiences. It needs to be concise and brief. That is a challenge because it is a very technical document. So that's likely to lead us to having a short, snappy LNRS, probably supplemented with sort of technical appendices for those stakeholders who are interested in that level of detail. People also wanted multiple ways of interacting with the LNRS, which is interesting. So this was some of the comments we had around this were, the kind of obvious suggestion of a website, but also the map having more layers of interactivity than just showing the habitat. So for example, it might also include suggestions for what you can do in particular regions, potentially signposting to either web information hosted by ourselves or partners on, well, it could be anything, monitoring and surveying, access to special interest groups, advice on habitat management, those kinds of things. And that leads on to the next point, which is around provision of additional information. So these are all things that we taking on board. And it falls into that point I made at the beginning, I suppose, around what LNRS can be, because none of this outside of having a map is statutory. So we're currently looking at how are we going to host this, where are we going to host it, and what can we have ready for launch, and then what can we build in as we progress through LNRS delivery. And that takes us up to April, really, at which point we sort of had a bit of a pause for reflection on how we'd gotten on to date. That was the point at which we confirmed extending the timeline into later into 2024, and the period during which all of the analysis of the engagement took place. So behind the scenes, from a technical side, we have pretty much finalised the long lists for biodiversity priorities and measures. We're not quite there yet, but almost. So then next steps lead on to the shortlisting process. As we've seen, had the existing areas of importance map completed, and that is alongside what's been quite a complicated data portal to set up, which is currently available to organisations as part of the technical development team for LNRS, and may well likely end up forming the basis of the publicly accessible map later in the development cycle. So our forward plan, as of today anyway, is a very busy May and June. So we've got our project team meetings coming up over the next couple of weeks. We spent Sunday actually in Hull talking about LNRS and engaging with Hull residents and other stakeholders at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust's Team Wilder Empowerment Day. And then May through June, we've got a suite of technical workshops for our project team. So we're running workshops specifically for local authority officers from the 2 councils involved, and then we are running half a dozen habitat-themed workshops for technical specialists, and those are going to be where they focus on identifying measures and opportunities. Next week, we will hopefully have developed a or finalised criteria for shortlisting to apply to that long list as well. It's quite important that we have a set of criteria which does allow for shortlisting to take place, so it does allow for differentiation between different habitats and species and measures. So we're currently looking at how we weight those criteria, because otherwise everything kind of comes out at the end with the same score. And that's all being led by our technical experts. We're facilitating the sessions, but they are the best minds in the region for the job. And that sort of brings us to the